1985. My apartment in New York City. A sudden realization, and not a pleasant one. My 30th birthday was right around the corner. I'm poised to turn 1 year older than Batman. Batman? My favorite childhood hero? That lantern-jawed, ever-wise father figure? I'm actually going to be older than Batman? This was intolerable. Something had to be done. Welcome back to BatFacts, where this episode we round out our look at the Batman works of Frank Miller by discussing the Dark Knight Trilogy. I conceived of a story where Batman was the impossibly old age of 50. This was the genesis for Miller's first effort with the Caped Crusader, and over the coming months Frank crafted a story that would chronicle Batman's final case, and just by happenstance, make him once again older than Miller. Working closely with DC editor Dick Giordano, and bouncing ideas off of his comic book contemporaries, Miller's script admittedly began as an enthusiastic mess of cool moments, which later became larger than the sum of their parts in what many regard as the greatest Batman story ever told. Though now collected as one title, what resulted was 4 separate and distinct books: The Dark Knight Returns, The Dark Knight Triumphant, Hunt the Dark Knight, and The Dark Knight Falls. That together made an epic tale of redemption, indomitable will, and relinquishing of demons both inner and external. A story that begins with a man lost, impatient for his impending death, and ends with that same man besting the most powerful force on the planet. Miller's Batman was gritty, angry, violent, and obsessive, a stark contrast to the smiling super friend of Comics Code era publishing, and this contrast would help lift the curse of Biff Bang Pow that marred Batman in public opinion since the Batu-C dancing caricature played by Adam West in the 1966 television show, and its success showed that audiences were on board for a darker version of The Dark Knight, paving the way for the 1989 film. It would change the way many writers depict not just Batman, but superheroes in general. 1986 was also the year Alan Moore's Watchmen was released, and the 1-2 punch of both releases essentially brought comics into the modern era, with their brash new takes on the superhero genre. I joked to Alan once that he did the autopsy on the idea of superheroes, and I did the brass band funeral, Miller said. Because it really did feel to me like a handful of grown-up fans waving our childhood heroes a fond goodbye. Along with the Batman story for the ages, Miller also crafted a visual style that could always be differentiated as his Batman. The lantern jaw, the short ears, the huge torso. These details remain through several animated interpretations, video game character skins, and appearances in other comic books, such as this appearance in the Batman Planetary crossover, where the Planetary team are visited by Batman throughout time, or this similar dream sequence in this issue of Man of Steel, or this issue of Justice Society of America, or the Batman Arkham Knight Annual. Miller himself contributed this drawing of Batman and Carey on the cover of humor book Amazing Man. Arthur Adams included the Dark Knight in this Elseworld piece for Wizard magazine. And Greg Capullo drew Miller's Batman into the final action sequence of 2018's Dark Knight's Metal. Miller's Superman is featured in the miniseries Countdown Arena by Keith Champagne. And lastly, the New 52 saw Carey Kelly briefly featured as young Damian Wayne's acting tutor, first appearing at a costume party, unsurprisingly, dressed as Robin. Pitched by Miller and DC editor Bob Schreck as a shot of adrenaline to an ailing comics industry, 2001's Dark Knight Strikes Again continued thematically from its predecessor, highlighting Batman's capacity to inspire others, most notably Carey Kelly, who returns as Catgirl. But where Dark Knight Returns is a relatively intimate story about a man reconciling his own demons, Strikes Again is huge, bombastic, and involves almost the entire DCU against a global threat. In fact, the Atom, the Question, the Flash, Wonder Woman, Captain Marvel, Green Arrow, Lex Luthor, Brainiac, and Superman are all introduced into the story before Batman makes his first appearance at the very end of issue 1. Superman also has Batman beat in terms of screen time. There's approximately 111 drawings of Superman over the series' 3 issues, compared to merely 89 of Batman. Save for a couple of inner monologue refrains and a brief appearance by Rob and Dawn, it really doesn't read much like a Batman story, and certainly not a continuation of The Dark Knight Returns. It's sort of like if Avengers Infinity War was titled Iron Man Strikes Again. Which begs the question, was this just a case of having the wrong title? Would this book have been put under as much scrutiny had it not been so emphatically hailed as the direct sequel to The Dark Knight Returns? If it was called something that gave more accurate expectations like Frank Miller's Brave and the Bold or Dark Knight, World's Finest, would it have been so harshly judged? Miller himself said that the book was initially hatched as a romp, a re-injection of day-glow fun into what had become a relentlessly grim superhero landscape, which sounds great, but doesn't sound much like a sequel to Dark Knight Returns, as much as it sounds like a reaction to it. It wasn't Dark Knight, but he had done that, argued Grant Morrison in DK2's defense. In reading the book, the most noticeable difference is its visual style. Gone is the deep palette of watercolors featured in Dark Knight Returns. In its place, returning colorist Lynn Varley utilized still burgeoning computer coloring techniques for a very colorful, experimental coloring job. On the line work, Miller employed a much looser, more expressionistic style to his drawings, with less consistent results. There's an unevenness to the line weight, and many characters look under-rendered or just kind of garish. This jarring contrast from his predecessor rubbed many the wrong way. Then, on September 11th, 2001, September 11th, 2001 happened. Issue 2 of Strikes Again had just been completed, and Frank Miller, a New Yorker, was deeply affected by the day's events and the resulting turmoil. I think many people didn't get over it, that it will continue to affect their lives forever. And I think Frank is one of those people, said Lynn Farley in a 2014 interview. The Dark Knight Strikes Again shifted gears for its third issue, becoming a not-so-subtle reaction to 9/11, while bringing the story to a messy conclusion. Miller would continue down this path for his next project, and if readers thought Miller's final issue of Strikes Again lacked subtlety, they hadn't seen anything yet. I don't want to spend too much time on this one because it's not, and should never have been, a Batman book. But the most controversial and polarizing project of Frank Miller's career, 2011's Holy Terror, began its life as Holy Terror Batman. Originally described as a propaganda comic by Miller, seeking to follow in the footsteps of Superman and Captain America punching out Hitler, this was to be Frank Miller's Batman vs. Al-Qaeda, the would-be follow-up to Dark Knight Strikes Again. Somewhere in the middle of the book's production, DC and Miller wisely parted ways, and the Batman character lost his emblem and ears and became the Fixer. His cat burglar sidekick went from Selina Kyle to Natalie Stack, and even Commissioner Gordon had an obvious analog. It's sort of like when Rob Liefeld released The Fighting American after he was let go from writing and drawing Captain America, but more on that guy next episode. The story of Holy Terror is, to put it lightly, in extremely questionable taste. Gallons of digital ink was spent decrying the book upon release, including one Wired.com reviewer who called it one of the most appalling, offensive, and vindictive comics of all time. While not defending it, Sequart's Julian Darius points out that Holy Terror is a bold interpretation of a genre, every bit as much as Dark Knight Returns and Sin City. It's just that the genre, patriotic propaganda demonizing and dehumanizing the enemy, is one that's fallen out of fashion. Miller's artwork is done in an unrestrained, fervent progression of his black and white Sin City artwork, and it's some of the best of his latter career. To be clear, Holy Terror should never have been a Batman book, but I do think it's a shame we didn't get to see a Batman book that employed this particular art style. After the release of Holy Terror in 2011, Miller wouldn't release another comic for nearly 5 years. Star Wars The Force Awakens broke records and helped to usher in a new era of weaponized nostalgia, with properties like Jurassic Park and Alien and scores of others following suit. Approaching the 30th anniversary of The Dark Knight Returns, DC unleashed some member berries of their own, announcing Dark Knight 3: The Master Race. Co-written by Miller and Brian Azzarello and drawn in a very Miller-esque style by Andy Kubert. The first issue was released with more than 70 variant covers, featuring a who's who of comic book talents, tellingly recreating their favorite moments from The Dark Knight Returns. Some artists, such as Greg Capullo, Jim Lee, and Gabrielle Delato, provided Dark Knight Returns variant covers for the Master Race's entire 9-issue run, and all the variant covers were collected in a hardcover art book. It really felt like nearly the entire comic book industry paying respects to a classic, and with no disrespect to the story being told beyond these covers, seeing the various reworkings of Dark Knight Returns classic moments was the highlight of the series. Dark Knight 3: The Master Race actually follows a very similar trajectory to Star Wars. If The Dark Knight Returns is a classic, genre-defining original Star Wars trilogy, and Strikes Again is definitely its disappointing prequels, The Master Race course corrects into familiar grounds while still pushing the story forward and is largely shepherded by a new addition creatively. Advertised as the third part of a Dark Knight trilogy for its entire marketing, just before the release of the first issue, Miller surprised everybody, including DC, by announcing he was working on a fourth part on his own, calling into question the depth of he and Azzarello's collaboration. I thoroughly applaud what Brian Azzarello's doing, but now that he's doing his, it's now a 4-part series, and I'm doing the fourth, he told Newsarama. Upon the series' conclusion, the 3 was unceremoniously removed from the title for the collected graphic novel, now simply called Dark Knight: The Master Race. Most recently, Miller signed a 5-project deal with DC Comics, but it's unclear if one of these will be the aforementioned 4th Dark Knight project. The first announced was Superman Year One, drawn by John Romita Jr. A launch title for DC's new Black Label imprint, it's uncertain whether this Superman book will take place in the Millerverse, but the second announced project, a young adult book starring Carrie Kelly, most certainly will. With this many projects on the horizon, it seems likely we'll be revisiting the Millerverse sooner than later. But until then, this ends our look at the Millerverse. If you like the channel, please tell a friend who likes Batman. Like, subscribe, and as always, support your local comic shop. Look out for the next episode where we look at the trials and tribulations of Slade Wilson, aka Deathstroke. SOme Bat-Time, same Bat channel. Thanks for watching.